Hi everyone, I have decided to do my semester cultural project on human trafficking victims. So this is a little overview of what my table of contents is going to look like. So I have the first slide identifying the culture, then we go into historical information, the third slide being stereotypes and myths. Then I go over to cultural practices, communication styles, strategies to improve how human trafficking can get resolved, and key components. So starting off with the first slide, I have identifying the culture. My topics for this are lack of control, physical and mental health, and behavioral clues. So to start off, I'll go under lack of control. This is basically how victims are trained to not come in contact with anyone. A lot of the time, it's because they don't want their cover to be blown. They want to keep whoever they have with them. And as you can see in this one, there is a possibility of their families being threatened or killed if they try and escape. That basically summarizes they are usually distanced from others due to being told that their families are being threatened by the person who took them. They also don't move a lot on their own or usually ever. The trafficker usually takes all of their travel IDs and documents. A lot of the time, if you come in contact with someone like this, you can see someone is speaking on their behalf. So move over to physical and mental health. A lot of signs of this are bruising and burns. They can also appear malnourished or unhealthy due to eating disorders or not eating enough, not enough water. They can be dehydrated or a lot of untreated medical conditions. They're usually in fear or distress in situations, like they can have a lot of depression or anxiety when you come in contact with them. Also, another sign is branding tattoos. Traffickers usually mark their territory, usually on the back of their ear or lower back for quote-unquote ownership. Lastly, behavioral clues, which is providing inconsistent, odd, or maybe even scripted answers to any questions. They usually avoid eye contact with people from law enforcement. And there's also a lot of signs of limited to no social interaction because they are usually kept and held captive in their environment with the traffickers. Moving on to historical information, in the 1500s through present day human trafficking, for the Transatlantic Slave Trade Act, around 12.5 million slaves were shipped off from Africa around the world, and 10.7 million of those arrived in the Americas, including Caribbean, South America, and North America. 1850 to 1900 was the traffic of Chinese women into the United States. These Chinese women were drawn to the United States from the promise of jobs associated with the California Gold Rush and the construction of the Central Pacific Roadway, the railroad roadway. They became targets of racial hatred and violence because of their economic threat. And in the 2000s, this was the first agreement that acknowledges modern-day slavery. This was also a possibility of human trafficking on men being victims, and the UNODC, which is the United Nations on Drug and Crime, founded the UN GIFT, which is the United Nations Global Initiative to Fight Human Trafficking. This was renewed to commit the world leaders combat human trafficking. And our present-day fight against human trafficking, a lot of different organizations focused on different aspects of human trafficking. There's a lot of prevention initiatives such as education, skills training, or legislation. And other focused on aftercare and providing for people who have been removed from human trafficking. So my next slide, stereotype and myths. This goes through the reality and the myths themselves. So my most commonly seen myth was only women and girls are victims, which is not true at all. Men and boys of any age, race, and gender can be victims of both sex and labor trafficking. My next one is victims will ask for help when they get the chance of freedom, which is not entirely true. It can be sometimes, but a lot try not to self-identify because of the loyalty of being misplaced by their trafficker or the trust of law enforcement with that kind of help. Victims come from poverty or specific backgrounds. No, the reality of this is victims can come from any backgrounds. With a history of abuse that increases the risk, and they come from any background or group. physical force is always involved. This is not true. There's a psychological abuse, there's frauds and threats that are most common, along with emotional manipulation. There's a lot of control tactics rather than physical violence. Some short cultural practices. There's a lot of harmful practices from human trafficking that devalue women and girls, trying to create a primary vulnerability to trafficking. And some of these harmful traditional practices can be early childhood marriage, female genitalia mutilation, and then the acceptance of child labor, which is sending children to work, sometimes used as methods of persuading by traffickers to control their victims. So there is a lot of communication styles. My top were control, isolation, difficulty with self-identification, being lost, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and manipulation. So I'll go over those. Control, usually making false promises like a better life or money, security, and the love of their life, just basically manipulating them, and that's when we go into manipulation. Using deceptive language to make the situation normal or seem appealing, basically trying to control their minds to think that this is okay and that they're going to be okay, which leads into physical abuse. Sometimes they will say no to this manipulation tactic, and physical abuse like injuries, health issues, loyalty marks, any of those can be set into emotional abuse, which leads to PTSD, anxiety, trauma, and trauma bonding. And then isolation, there's a lot of bad living conditions, like control, basically manipulation and control. They say no to this, they'll put them in a back room, they'll put them in a cage. I've seen and heard a lot of it. Basically putting them in bad living conditions for a certain amount of time until they say yes to whatever question or action they wanted them to do. And then the difficulty with self-identification. A lot of survivors may not be able to identify as victims because they have been trafficked their entire life and it became part of their normal life. And basically this goes into being lost, coaching the victims to use rehearsed lines when speaking to outsiders to avoid detection. Some strategies to improve the communication with survivors is prioritizing their safety and reassuring them that they have entitled rights. Empowering language, like you have the right to live without being abused, and small words of affirmation like that to get them back in the mindset of knowing that they are okay and that this is not going to happen again. You can also, following Traffic Victims Protection Act, informing the victims that they can apply for special visas or receive other forms of immigration field under the act. Public awareness is talking to survivors about their experiencing and making sure this is not a re-traumatizing event for them, making sure that the material is sensitive. Encouraging open communication and fostering a culture where conversations can happen openly, making sure the youth are seeking help if they need from a trusted adult. Finding these things early can help prevent human trafficking. Recognizing that a technology is a form of communication and that it can happen through various apps and platforms that can be used for grooming. This is why I talked about finding this in the early stage to avoid kidnapping or any exploitation acts. And lastly, my key components: what is done, how is it done, and why is it done. These tactics like force, fraud, deception, abduction, or abuse of power are tactics that are used to control the victim and ensure compliance. How is it done is commercial sex acts, forced labor or services, and slavery. There also can be some pretty harsh, like organ removal. I know that's a pretty hard thing to even think about, but there is a lot of physical force and things like that that can be done. I'm not going to go into detail about that because it does get pretty gross and graphic, but this is basically the intended outcome for the exploitation for profit. What the trafficker does to recruit, move, or obtain the victim: there's a lot of recruitment through other human trafficking victims. Like, they will go out on the streets, ask for help, and they will basically recruit them into a moving vehicle, take them away. Transportation, sometimes there is truckers who will pay money for sexual acts because they don't get action while they are driving trucks. A lot of these truck stops are human trafficking for money. Transfer, harboring, provision, and receipt of persons. So that is basically it for my slideshow. I appreciate the time and effort that was put into this class, and I am excited. Thank you.